Like, Tocqueville appreciated that the well-being of the liberal democratic order is dependent upon pre-liberal traditions that are, quote, ideally negated and condemned by the very conception of man's unlimited self-sovereignty. So in other words, if human beings are sovereign over themselves and the world, that understanding, not of the sovereignty of a free people, but of the absolute sovereignty of the individual, that understanding ultimately negates all of those moral inheritances and traditions that are necessary for the health and well-being of liberal democracy. It was precisely this issue that concerned Tocqueville. He expressed deep concerns about the maintenance of these pre- or extra-liberal traditions and habits, precisely because the democratic notion of consent does not limit itself to the political realm. By the way, we think of the idea of consent. You can't imagine a decent or free political order that doesn't recognize the importance of consent as a political principle, right? We don't want to be ruled by philosopher kings. Self-government involves consent. What happens when we start applying the idea of consent to every institution? All those authoritative institutions that were once thought to be necessary for the health and well-being of liberal democracy. I wonder in 1938 what professors would have thought of student evaluations. In the churches, the idea that there's no hierarchy or no authority, but it seems to me the very idea of a church in any meaningful sense of the term entails some element of hierarchy, including a hierarchy based on truth, right? Or family life. We know that the family cannot really be a democratic institution where the 12-year-olds have an equal vote, right? And yet you might say more and more the family, the university, and the churches are informed by an idea of autonomy and consent. So this is really what Tocqueville means when he wrote in 1835 that the dogma of popular sovereignty or consent regulates the greater part of human actions. He showed, I think, a rare and prophetic appreciation of the fact that democracy would democratize family, religion, and other inherited institutions in ever more democratic or individualistic directions. And you have a kind of conundrum here, because Tocqueville tells us the family and religion and inherited and traditional social institutions and practices are necessary for the health of democracy. And yet democracy transforms those very institutions that are necessary for that. If I'm enervating you and depressing you, it's not the final word. But this is the problem that Tocqueville highlights. And the beginning of wisdom, I think, is clarity about this problem. So Tocqueville was completely devoid of what I'm going to call progressivist illusions. The idea that things are getting better all of the time, or democracy is the upward march of the human race. Or in the words of a very bad philosopher, John Dewey, the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy, right? So he did not believe that the providential or fated character of the great democratic revolution of full unfolding before his eyes in any way guaranteed that this new dispensation would preserve the liberty and greatness of human beings. That depended on the prudence and the moral and political responsibility of human beings, on an art of liberty, as he called it, whose task was to preserve the conditions that made possible serious thought and noble and generous action. Tocqueville was a critic of what he called the democratic dogma, not of democracy, but of the democratic dogma, insofar it was linked to an unreflective passion for equality. You might say democracy is good, but the democratic dogma is problematic. Equality within limits is good, but an insatiable passion for equality is not so good. At the same time, Tocqueville was a friend of the Christian and democratic affirmation of the dignity inherent in the human soul as such. In the next part of my remarks, I want to talk briefly about a very revealing dialogue that Tocqueville had with a French diplomat and theorist of scientific racism named Arthur de Gobineau. They carried out a very extensive correspondence between 1843 and Tocqueville's death in 1859. So fascinating about this dialogue is, on the one hand, I've tried to express for you some of Tocqueville's very serious forebodings about the future of democracy. On the other hand, the great, this letter exchange, this ongoing letter exchange with Gobineau brings out Tocqueville's absolute contempt for those who wanted to replace democracy with some either racial or moral or philosophical affirmation of the radical inequality of human beings. And by the way, this was a period in the United States and Europe where scientific racism was a very fashionable ideology, so to speak. We'll talk about more about that in a minute. Tocqueville was impressed by the young Gobineau's intelligence and erudition, and in 1842 had commissioned him to assist him on a never-completed project to uncover the roots of modern morality and a distinctively modern moral sensibility. And when Tocqueville became Foreign Minister of France in 1849, you guess he was Foreign Minister of France, Gobineau served as his assistant and shortly thereafter attained a position as an ambassador in the permanent diplomatic corps. Tocqueville liked Gobineau. He had genuine affection for him and did everything he could to promote him professionally. But he also detested the scientism and racism that informed every page of the latter's multi-volume essay on the inequality of the races. In a letter to Gobineau dated November 17, 1853, written shortly after the publication of the essay, Tocqueville denounced the, quote, monstrous fatalism that informs all modern racial theories. Gobineau denied the physical and moral unity of the human race and wrote off whole peoples as inferior and degenerate, incapable of moral improvement or participation in the benefits of civilization. Tocqueville saw in Gobineau's theories a secular, materialist form of predestination, one that led to a, quote, vast limitation, if not a complete abolition of human liberty. Now, Tocqueville judged moral